We've all seen the scenes in American horror movies, following young lovers parked up in the woods to awkwardly fumble around in private without the worry of parents or passers-by. In these stories, they're always disturbed by one thing or another. Occasionally, this disturbance is nature calling, as the male counterpart of the two heads off to relieve himself, leaving the woman to wait impatiently in the darkness of the car. Other times, they are disturbed by a curious noise outside, luring the man away in search of answers. This narrative feels so natural to us, as so many of us attempted to seek refuge from our parents' gaze in our younger years, finding a place to park up and smoke, hang out, have sex, or simply play music into the night. Our first cars give us that feeling of ownership. That space is yours and yours alone. It is your home away from home. There is an element of safety that comes from sitting inside of your car. People will scream and shout from behind the steering wheel with a confidence that would never manifest without the steel box they were inside. But in truth, we all know deep down that we are not safe from the outside world. Our confidence is built on a naive landscape. But what if, as we hid from the world in the comfort of our metal cocoons, we also hid from safety? What if, as we seeked out a dark corner to park amongst, the darkness instead found us? My name is Luke Mordew, and this urban legend is The Dead Boyfriend. As one of the most retold urban legends, the scene has become a cliché in modern horror, with this story being told in numerous variations with several interpretations. This tale is often told around the campfire with the underlining message of a warning, to not stray too far from the safety of home when young, or to stay away from situations they could find themselves endangered by. On another level, it feeds deeper into society's fears of our young being out in the big wide world, full of strangers and mystery. Perhaps this is why this story has lived on for so long and continues to do so. At some point in our lives, we have all been in a dark place within our vehicles, convinced of our safety behind thin glass and locked doors. In my telling of this story, our lovers are called Claire and Joe, heading up the hilltop to look out upon the town below, away from peering eyes, isolated and alone. The hour was growing ever closer to midnight when the film ended at the local cinema. A twisted horror, telling the tale of a haunted house that Claire had convinced Joe to see with her on their date. He tended to lean more towards comedy, but in their young relationship, they had accommodated each other's genre of choice. It was an unusually warm night for the latter half of September. However, Claire still emphasized her chill to nudge Joe into wrapping his arm around her as they walked back to his car, both keen for an intimacy they had lacked in the passing week, forced to stay away from each other due to a mixture of school, part-time jobs and studies. They held hands tightly throughout the whole film. Claire rested her head on his arm when she could between his jumps of fright at the more terrifying moments of the picture, and if anything, this only added to the anticipation of each other. It wasn't as if they could just head back to one of their parents' houses after all. The tension between them was finally broken, unleashing excitement and possibility when Claire said, I don't have to be home by a certain time." She blurted it out the moment Joe turned on the car's engine, as if it had burst out of her the moment she realized that this was the end of the night. Joe smiled and told her he knew a beautiful view at the top of a large hill that overlooked the town if she wanted to go check it out. And with enthusiasm, she nodded back. "That sounds nice." The glow of the streets dimmed as the lights grew sparser, the numerous colours of the shops now left behind in the town in the distance. The grey concrete jungle had swiftly turned to greenery as they ventured deeper into the woods, higher up that isolated hill as Claire rested her hand on Joe's whilst he changed gears, both desperate to feel each other's skin. They parked by a small opening overlooking the town below that twinkled in a blanket of lights. But they didn't stop to appreciate it for long, instantly embracing in a passionate kiss, clambering over the knobs of the car to press their lustful bodies closer together. Chloe had already begun to undo Joe's belt on his jeans when he quickly pulled back, a night of slurping back a large fizzy drink to distract himself from the more nerve-wracking moments of the film had brought on an inevitable urge to relieve himself. "I'll be right back," he told her with a knowing smile, slightly laughing under his breath as he quickly exited the car, hurrying off into the darkness, continuing to undo his belt. She pulled down the visor and studied her reflection in the small but helpful mirror to fix her hair and makeup. Once confirming it was the best she could do in this situation, she checked up her nose to make sure it was clear before flinging it closed. She sat patiently for a moment longer, tapping her fingers on her knees as she exhaled deeply, waiting for his return. But after a few minutes had passed, both frustration and concern had begun battling for her top emotion. To keep herself busy, she reached out and flicked on the radio, igniting the poppy sounds of an enthusiastic beat bellowing through the darkness around her. But only half a verse managed to make its way out before it was disturbed by the sound of a thud mixed with a slight grunt in the distance, so faint that Claire wasn't even sure that she'd even heard it. She reached out and turned the volume down of the radio, listening carefully for the sounds to continue, but she was met with nothing but dead silence. "Joe?" she called out wishfully, now growing more concerned that much more time had passed. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and opened her messages to Joe, the last from him reading, "I'm looking forward to tonight." She typed a question mark and sent it, but to her dismay, it would not send. The signal was too weak up on the hilltop. As if by reflex, she pressed the call button and lifted the phone to her ear, waiting impatiently for it to ring, full of angst and frustrated hope. But this too did not connect. She leaned over the car's driver's seat, calling his name again into the darkness, unable to bring herself to reach too far out of the vehicle. She called his name again, this time filled with the frustration that she had been keeping at bay up till now. She tried calling his phone again, but to no avail. Her body was now tensing up as her subconscious cloaked her fear in anger, her logical mind telling her that Joe had found a perfect opportunity to play a prank on his new girlfriend. She tried to call again, reaching the phone ahead of her, lifting it out of the car to get a better signal, still refusing to allow herself to step out of its safety. She willed it to connect with all of her might as she watched its bright face against the black backdrop of the dark treetops above. The leaves rustled gently in the breeze, but this almost soothing sound was quickly interrupted by something that didn't seem to fit. Claire froze in her position, listening carefully to what sounded like movement in the bushes ahead. It could just be the wind, she thought to herself as she focused her senses on it, noticing its consistency seemed to move against the breeze around her. Whether it was Joe or not, she was now growing afraid and impatient with the antics, and she pulled her phone inside the car and slammed the door shut to lock her inside. She crawled back into the car's passenger seat and listened carefully, consistently trying to call Joe through the device in her hand as it continued to fail. A thud bellowed from the darkness again, causing her eyes to shoot up into the night ahead as she clambered to the driver's seat once more, instantly flicking on the headlights of the car to light the dark, revealing nothing but the greenery that had already begun to turn to an autumn bronze. She studied the area cautiously, her eyes flinging from left to right to cover all ground. She flicked the phone's torchlight on and pointed it out of the window to reveal the bushes to her right. But again, there was no sign of anyone. But she could hear the rough sounds of wood around her, as if something was scraping over a log. She leaned over the passenger seat and shone the light to the car's left. But once again, there was nothing, only more greenery and the cliff's edge that led into the town. She turned to shine the torchlight out of the back window, struggling to hold her phone steady in her trembling fingers. But before she could reach it, she was interrupted by the sudden squeaks of something scratching at the top of her car. She slightly screamed, covering her mouth to force herself into silence as she lowered her body into her chair, desperate to stay away from the sounds as much as possible. She listened, failing to hold back her violent tears as the tapping, squeaking, and scratching continued through the roof's metal. Finally, she screamed, "Go away!" in her desperation, and as if her voice had excited whatever it was on the top of her car, it began to occasionally slam loudly against the metal amongst the scratches and taps, causing the entire vehicle to shake. This was enough for Claire to decide it was time to go. She flipped in the chair, clamping her hands on the steering wheel and turning on the ignition. She looked around her one last time in a moment's hesitation, in desperate hope that Joe was making his way back to the car. But as she suspected, there was nobody to be seen. She put the car into first gear and pushed down on the pedal, but the car only managed a couple of inches before she felt a pull against something, as if the vehicle was somehow anchored to the ground. She stopped for a moment and listened over the gentle hum of the car to hear the slight crackles and gargles of a creature-like sound. Whatever was on top of the car was not normal. So once more, she slammed her foot down on the accelerator as the car struggled to move forward. She managed another couple of inches, but still, it did not seem to be working. Fine, she thought. I'll go backwards. She flung the gear into reverse, the embers of survival burning in the pit of her stomach as she turned her head to look out into the back window once again. But in the red light, she noticed a large tree with a thick rope stretched from the back of the car. It wrapped around the tree and up into the darkness above. She didn't understand how this had happened. The simple noises she had heard this entire time was somebody right behind her tying a trap to the car. But she didn't have time to assess the situation too intensely, so instead, she slammed her foot down on the pedal of the vehicle and flung back. A smile would have appeared on her relieved face as she saw the rope drop, if she had any time to register it at all. Instead, she was interrupted by the sudden corpse of Joe as he slammed onto the windscreen of his car. His face smashed into the glass momentarily before rolling onto the bonnet. Claire stopped the car, screaming in horror as she flung open the door, diving to the ground outside and clambering away as fast as she could. She watched the lifeless body in horror as a bright light shone at her from behind. She turned to see another car turning to the hilltop, music blaring from the old, cheap vehicle. It instantly halted as the driver witnessed the horrifying sight ahead of them. A busted car, a beaten body, and a crying victim on the floor. Claire did not waste any time, jumping to her feet and running to the car as fast as she could, waving them down, begging them to please help her, terrified that their fear would get the better of them and leave her stranded in the confusing and horrifying situation. The driver quickly jumped out of the vehicle, pacing towards her as his friend opened the back seat. Gently escorting her, they placed her in the car as swiftly as they could whilst the driver screamed for them to hurry up in a panicked state. They all got inside and slammed the car doors closed, instantly locking them as the passenger began to call the police whilst the driver reversed them out of the hilltop. And as they left, Claire looked over at her boyfriend again, still trying to comprehend the horror that had just unfolded and how little it made sense to her. And that's when she saw it. The rope was tightly tied to the back of the car. It stretched and wrapped around the tree before reaching up to a large branch above that was connected to Joe's neck. What she could hear on the roof of her car was Joe's desperate feet trying with all of his might to get her attention. And as she drove away to save herself, she had killed him. She had been tricked into being an accomplice to her own boyfriend's death. This story feels familiar to us for several reasons, like the setting, characters and atmosphere due to numerous iterations, homages and copies that have spread across the world as myth and legend over the years. It has even been immortalized in film and television, but perhaps the most familiar aspect of this urban legend is the anxieties that the story evokes. It is a fear that all parents feel at some point in their time, where our young venture into a dangerous new world, no longer needing us by their sides. By the time they're heading into their late teenage years, many are already driving with friends and partners. No longer are they playing a few roads away, heading home when the streetlights come on. Now they have the means necessary to venture into places that would be deemed too far on foot. From another angle, this anxiety comes with the fears in the young. After many years of dreaming of what opportunities and adventures would arise, the addition of a vehicle brings newfound confidence and readiness to join the adult world. This has been the case for decades, and yet, as always, hidden amongst the excitement of the unknown is a dash of anxiety that seeps its way through the cracks. This story suggests that the transition into adulthood may not be as smooth as first believed. It is a dark reminder that although you are becoming a big fish in the tank of adolescence, you are about to become a tiny fish in a vast, dangerous sea. The legend itself is an evolution of the far tamer but far older urban legend, the Hook Man. But in its evolution, it has become a far more graphic and horrifying tale. Perhaps that graphic imagery and this story were morphing simultaneously, products of a world that grows harder to shock with every decade that passes. These stories, much like many of the urban legends we tell, tend to blend seamlessly into the world of cinema. It is common for these campfire stories to be developed and integrated into screenplays, only to be filmed and exported to cinemas worldwide. According to film expert and critic Mark Kermode, this particular story and those like it function as a morality archetype on youth sexuality. This would explain the expansion of slashers involving teenagers from the 70s onwards, created by the now adults who had been part of the sexual awakening of the 60s. The latter half of the 20th century was when the story truly engulfed the excitable dark corners of society's imagination. 1980's He Knows You're Alone opened with a scene where a young couple is attacked and killed whilst parked in a car. It was only a year later that a version of this tale appeared in the collection of short horrors, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. The story of murders down a lover's lane has proved to be as unkillable as the cinematic serial killers the idea has inspired over the years. Featuring in far more films than I've mentioned and numerous television episodes across the board around the world. Each one adds a subtle change or rewrite to the narrative, creating their own, slightly different turn of events unfolding down a lover's lane. And although my story focused on the lesser-known version of the tale, the premise and the ideas remain ultimately the same. Identical twins in every way except the small, intricate details that separate them. But we must ask ourselves, is any of this based on truth? The answer is yes, although it may not be as straightforward as you may first think. This has happened on more than one occasion, and not all of them predate the legend itself. If you're still with me, then I know you share the same passion for folklore and urban legends that drives this show. But to keep bringing you these stories, I need your help. Every season comes to life with the incredible support of listeners like you on Patreon. For just £3 a month, less than the price of a small coffee, you can help ensure that this show continues to thrive, with shorter breaks between seasons and even more content available. But that's not all. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll unlock exclusive perks like access to our bonus series, Modern Myths, where we dive into lesser-known but equally captivating tales like the Hodag, Black-Eyed Children, the Dark Watchers, and many more. You'll gain instant access to our entire library of bonus content the moment you join, with new chapters coming each season. You'll also get a behind-the-scenes look at how the show is made, discounts on merchandise, and an invitation to our private group chat, where you can connect with me directly and share your love for urban legends with a community of like-minded enthusiasts. Plus, as a special treat, I randomly select patrons to feature in upcoming stories, so you might find yourself becoming part of the very legends we explore. Supporting us on Patreon isn't just about subscribing. It's about joining a team dedicated to preserving and expanding on our collection of folklore. Your contribution directly fuels the research, production, and growth of the show, helping us continue this incredible journey together. So, if you're ready to take the next step and become an integral part of the Urban Legends community, head over to our Patreon page via the link in our show notes and choose the paid subscription. I'm looking forward to seeing you there, where we can keep these tales alive. And now, back to the legend. Although not linked initially, the first attack occurred on the 22nd of February, 1946. It was around 1:45 when Jimmy Hollis, age 24, and his girlfriend, Mary Jean Larey, age 19, parked on a long, secluded lover's lane after spending the evening at the local cinema. They would only be there for 10 minutes before a man wearing a white cloth mask with eye and mouth holes cut out would appear at Hollis's driver's side door, shining his torch through the window. Jimmy was unsure if the man was, in fact, simply trying to play a prank on him, and so he told him that he believed he had the wrong guy. The masked man replied, "I don't want to kill you, fellow, so do what I say." Shortly after, Jimmy and Mary were ordered out of the car, where Jimmy was commanded to remove his trousers. It was then that the masked man would strike Jimmy across the head twice with a heavy, blunt object. Mary would later confess to investigators that the crack of metal against bone was so loud that she'd initially assumed it was a gunshot instead of the sound of a fracturing skull. She had assumed, as many of us would, that they were in the process of being robbed, and so, to stop any more violence and to save both of their lives, Mary pulled out Jimmy's wallet and showed the masked man the empty contents inside to prove that they had nothing to give. But instead of leaving, the masked man struck her as well. Struggling to her feet, the attacker then ordered her to run, even dictating which road she should run down. Panicked and confused, Mary began to flee, but this only lasted a moment as the attacker caught up with her again. She told the marauder that she had run because he had told her to which he responded that she was a liar, striking her down again, and sexually assaulting her with the barrel of his gun in a warped, cruel game of cat and mouse. She begged him to kill her, but instead was saved by the sound of what was an oncoming car. That scared the assailant off and away. And after the assault, Mary fled, running half a mile until she came by a house where she would ask for help. Here, she could find safety and finally contact the police. And whilst this escape to safety was occurring, Jimmy had regained consciousness, managing to flag down a passerby in his dazed and confused state. The driver left Jimmy there whilst they sped off to a nearby funeral home where they called the police. And within half an hour, Bowie County Sheriff W.H. Bill Presley and 3 officers arrived at the scene of the crime. Mary was hospitalized overnight for minor head wounds, with much of her ordeal being the psychological turmoil that came with the events. Jimmy, on the other hand, required 3 months of hospitalization to recover from the multiple skull fractures he had incurred. But luckily, both the victims of this Lover's Lane crime had survived. To add a spanner in the works of this investigation, Mary and Jimmy both gave conflicting reports as to the appearance of their attacker. Mary had claimed the man was wearing a white bag over his head with cutouts for their eyes and mouth, but she could see enough flesh to confirm the man was African American. Jimmy, on the other hand, claimed the man was white, around 30 years old, but did admit he could not distinguish his features as he had been blinded by the torchlight that shone through the glass, with one of the only corroborating factors being that the assailant was at least 6 foot tall. Law enforcement took an unorthodox approach to this information. Over the next 2 months, they rejected Jimmy's account and badgered Mary, even going as far as to suggest that she knew the true identity of their attacker and was covering for them, something she denied for the rest of her life. It was only 4 weeks later that another Lover's Lane incident had occurred, although, as often happens with sequels, this one took a step even further than before. It was 24th of March 1946, and Richard L. Griffin, aged 29, and his girlfriend, Polly Ann Moore, aged only 17, were found dead in Griffin's sedan on a Sunday morning by a passing driver. The motorist later explained that he saw the parked car on a Lover's Lane named Rich Road and pulled over to check on them. At first, he had assumed that both passengers were asleep. It was only as he edged closer that he realized that Richard was perched between the front seat on his knees. His head was resting on his crossed hands, his pockets turned inside out. Polly was found with what seemed to be a less thought-out placement, sprawled out, face down in the back seats. No gun was found at the crime scene, ruling out the theory of a murder-suicide, not to mention that both had died from a gunshot to the back of the head. The blood on the inside of the car and the blood-soaked patch of earth outside the vehicle strongly suggested to officers that the victims had been killed outside and placed into their positions in the vehicle once dead. These murders led to a city-wide investigation, along with Texas and Arkansas City Police, the Department of Public Safety, and Miller and Cass County Sheriff's Departments. This large-scale investigation had erupted, with the local police interviewing between 50 to 60 potential witnesses within 3 days of the victim's discovery. With little to no information regarding the killer's motives or whereabouts, the police posted a $500 reward to gain new information in the hopes that they could finally follow a path that would lead to an arrest and conviction. However, the reward brought nothing but dozens of false leads by those hoping for some extra cash. Whispers had begun to spread through Texarkana of a connection between the murders and a deranged killer out on the hunt. although at this point the concern had not evolved to panic just yet. But that changed in the early morning of the 14th of April of that year. It was 6 o'clock in the morning when the Weaver family were driving down a remote country road northeast of Texarkana in Nevada County, Arkansas. During this innocent journey, the family spotted the corpse of a man lying on the north shoulder of the road, and the family pulled up at the nearest house to report what they had seen. The cadaver, who had been murdered by gunshot with 4 bullet wounds, would soon be identified as 17-year-old Jimmy Martin, a young man from Kilgore who resided just over 100 miles away. The investigators would learn that Jimmy had been in town visiting friends, and the night previously had been spent on a date with a 15-year-old girl by the name of Betty Jo Booker. The investigators' fears were confirmed when they discovered that Betty had also not arrived home that night. Local volunteers stepped forward to help with the search for Betty, and it was not long before 3 of Betty's friends discovered her body behind a tree nearly 2 miles from where Jimmy was found. She had been shot twice. The killer's actions seemed different this time, spreading the victims further apart. Made all the stranger still when Jimmy's car was found just over a mile away from his body, and 3 miles from Betty's with the keys still in the ignition. Although, once again, the connections to Lovers Lanes was brought forward once more as the car had been found at the entrance of Spring Lake Park, a place the young couple intended to visit as another popular Lovers Lane. This was one murder too many for the town, and the once gossiping whispers had become anxious conversations as the town began to fall into understandable panic. The nightlife in the town had slowed significantly, and the local teenagers, who were now horrified and terrified by what was happening to them, began to stay indoors at night, enforced by their parents' newly placed curfews. Hardware stores in the area reportedly sold out on safety mechanisms such as deadbolt locks, guns, and ammo as the town stocked up to keep their loved ones safe. And as many in the town tried to keep themselves away from the streets, newspaper reporters from all over the world took their place as they tried to get the scoop. During this time, the Texarkana Daily News grabbed the bull by the horns, christening the killer with the now infamous name of the Phantom Killer, which would catch on as its official moniker alongside the Texarkana Phantom. The pressure was on for the authorities to stop the killer once and for all, but this proved to be more troublesome than they had hoped. The evidence left behind at the scenes of the crimes was minimal, and much of it was tainted by the locals who had arrived at the crime scenes before a more profound investigation could take place. The FBI had checked the unaccounted for fingerprints that were found on the vehicles, but there was nothing in the database that showed up as a match. Eventually, the police began to perform sting operations, putting their younger-looking officers onto the streets, hoping to lure out the Phantom. On some occasions, it has even been reported that some officers left their children in cars to see if it drew the killer out. Although, during this time, there was not even a nibble on the bait they had laid out for him. By now, the reward money for successful tips was $4,280. But just like before, this attracted nothing but false leads and those trying to make a quick buck. With all this, the frustration with the authorities was growing, and the locals' anxieties was intensifying. Some had even begun to hope that perhaps the killer had moved on and that the town would be safe once again. That was until several weeks later, on the 3rd of May, 1946. Although the Phantom had chosen his victims in a different situation this time. The lovers were now veering closer to middle-aged and in the comfort of their own homes. Virgil Starks, aged 37, and his wife, Katie Starks, aged 36, lived on a modest, Reach-style house on a 500-acre farm off the highway. As he always did, Virgil clicked on his favorite weekly radio show and sat in his armchair in the living room. Katie was in the bedroom, lying on the bed to give Virgil some alone time with his show, when she heard a noise from the back of the house. She had asked Virgil to turn down the radio, but it was too late by then. 2 gunshots blasted into the back of his head from a closed double window, not 3 feet from where he sat. Katie, surprisingly, did not hear the gunshots and instead mistook the sound for the breaking of glass, most likely due to the shattering of the windows as the bullets passed through. At first, she believed that Virgil had dropped something, only realizing the horror of the events when she walked into the living room to see Virgil stand up momentarily before slumping back into his chair. She ran to him, lifting his head, only now realizing that he had just died before her. She darted to the phone with haste, but before she could dial for the police, she was also shot through the window twice, straight into her face. One of the bullets entered her right cheek, passing through her mouth and exiting behind her left ear. The other bullet entered below her lip, breaking her jaw and splintering out several teeth before lodging under her tongue. She had dropped to the floor, but got back onto her feet, running to get a pistol from the living room. This proved difficult, as her view was obstructed by the gushing blood that poured from her face, blinding her. In her panic, she could hear the killer tearing their way through the screen wire of the back porch as they fought to enter the house. Thinking she was going to be killed, Katie made her way to the bedroom at the front of the house to leave a note. But before she could, she heard the horrifying sounds of the killer entering the house through the kitchen window. With her face gushing with blood and sweat, full of large open wounds, her bones shattered and splintered, and a pain that we can only imagine, Katie sprinted out of the room, darting through the house, ensuring to keep her distance from the hunter that stalked her movements. With a river of blood and segments of teeth and bone left inside, Katie finally flung open the front door and ran as fast as possible. Still barefoot and in her blood-soaked nightgown, she made her way across the street to her sister and brother-in-law's house, but frustratingly, nobody was home. With sheer determination and will, Katie continued further, at least another 50 yards, until she arrived at another house. When they answered the door, she gasped, "Virgil's dead," before collapsing in front of them. The front page of the newspapers the following morning was full of frenzy, blasting cap-locked headlines in their bold fonts as the fear, disgust, and excitement buzzed through the media and injected itself into the households around the country once more. After studying the scene, it was noted by the FBI that it was incredible that Katie had not bled to death with the streams of thick blood that had stained all floors across the house. Investigators looked further into the murders, stating that an automatic rifle must have been used. It was also declared that after killing Virgil, the murderer waited outside the window for Katie to arrive so he could do it again. They found 3 substantial clues at the horrifying scene of the Starks household. The first was a flashlight in a hedge underneath the window the couple was shot from. The second was the bloody footprints around the house and smudged fingerprints on the surfaces. The third was the caliber of bullets used to commit the murder. Sheriff Davis publicly stated that, due to the caliber of bullets being different to the previous crimes, this murder could not necessarily be directly linked to the Phantom. Many in the local law enforcement believed this to be a copycat killing by an opportunist with a grudge against the Starks. This was due to several factors. Firstly, the bullets were .22 caliber rather than the usual .32 caliber. The victims were much older than usual. They were, of course, inside their residence rather than out on a lover's lane. And the Starks lived in Arkansas, whilst the first 3 crimes happened on the Texas side of town. Even so, the Starks attack is embedded in the story of the Phantom Killer to this day. Officers had detained at least 12 potential suspects, but out of them, only 3 stayed on for further questioning. With 50 officers working around the clock to solve the mysteries, including sheriffs of 4 counties, the FBI, and Texas Rangers, the amount of evidence and eventual progress was frustratingly slow. Amongst all these individuals, law enforcement theorized an unofficial diagnosis of sex mania due to the victims' overt undertones of sexuality and love. On top of this, none of the victims had been robbed, suggesting the reward was psychological. In fact, Katie Stark's purse had been left on the bed untouched, and it contained money and jewels. As expected, this sexier, sellable new hypothesis exploded in the media as the Texarkana Gazette plastered the bold headline, "Sex Maniac Hunted in Murders." This caused an eruption in gossip and hearsay to explode amongst the people that lived in the vicinity of these crimes, spreading the stories further into the outer towns, with the story expanding and evolving to fit several narratives, birthing a new urban legend. It seemed the murderer could hide amongst the noise and confusion that the rumor mill had created. That was until Max Tackett, a 33-year-old Arkansas State Police officer, realized that a car had been stolen and later abandoned on the night of the 3 Lovers Lanes murders. On the 28th of June, the police located a missing car that had been stolen on the night of Jimmy Martin and Betty Jo Booker's murders. And so, Max Tackett decided to stake it out until somebody returned to it. When they finally did, he arrested them on the spot, finding them to be a woman, 21-year-old Peggy Swinney. She told him that she had just gotten married, but that her husband was away, currently in Atlanta, Texas, trying to sell another stolen car. After speaking with the chief of police in Atlanta, Max found that a man had tried to sell a stolen car to one of their citizens. Max spoke to the citizen, but they told him that, unfortunately, if they were to see the car salesman again, they probably wouldn't recognize him. But that gave Max an idea. This citizen had a very distinct appearance, including a cowboy hat and boots. Max knew that although this citizen would not recognize the car salesman, there was a good chance the salesman would recognize the citizen. Max and the cowboy citizen walked to several public places around town with the idea that if they came across the man they searched for, he would try to avoid them. It was on a Saturday in July when Max and the cowboy walked into the Arkansas Motor Coach bus station to see a man run out of the back of the building at the very sight of them. Max chased down the individual, obtaining him at the fire escape. And once in custody, the man, Yule Swinney, would not talk. But unfortunately for him, his wife Peggy confessed in great detail that he was, in fact, the Phantom Killer. Due to the laws in 1946, Peggy could not be forced to testify against her husband, and because many considered her an unreliable witness, Yule was not arrested for the murder. Instead, with only circumstantial evidence, Swinney was sent to prison as a habitual offender for car theft. There is a considerable amount of doubt regarding Yule Swinney's guilt, but several factors are compelling, although circumstantial. The first is that the car Peggy Swinney was arrested for stealing was the one reported missing on the night of the murders of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. The second, that I admit is easily lied about, is that when Max finally caught Yul, he begged, "Please don't shoot me." When Officer Tackett replied, "I'm not going to shoot you for stealing cars," Yul reportedly replied back, "Mister, don't play games with me. You want me for more than stealing cars." The third is a similar case of Yul putting his foot in his mouth, according to the police. Chief Deputy Tillman Johnson claims that when he was in the police car with Yul, he asked, "Mr. Johnson, what do you think they'll do to me for this? Will they give me the chair?" Johnson responded with, "You won't get much, maybe 5 or 10 years. They don't give you the electric chair for stealing cars." It was here that Yul Swinney reportedly replied, "Mr. Johnson, you got me for more than stealing cars." To make matters worse for him, when the lawyer told Peggy that her husband was being held for murder before she confessed, she apparently exclaimed, "How did they find out?" However, again, take this with a pinch of salt, as the police are not above pushing an agenda when they believe they have their man. Although more damningly, Peggy's family and Yul's brother-in-law all believed that Yul was, in fact, the Phantom, not giving his judgment of character the best light to shine through. It seems that once Yul had caught wind that the police had nothing on him except circumstantial evidence, he decided to keep his mouth shut to allow the process to run its course. On the other hand, Peggy had already confessed to her husband's actions, revealing detailed information, including some that officers already knew, and some that they surprisingly did not. Nevertheless, this was not a clear-cut arrest. It was by no means a smooth process, with many complications arising, throwing several spanners in the machinery and clogging its progress. Firstly, Yul's fingerprints did not match any latent prints at the crime scene. Secondly, Peggy Swinney recanted her confessions and often changed her story, already throwing doubt amongst the police on her sincerity and reliability. The Texas Rangers and Sheriff Bill Presley were not even convinced that Swinney was the Phantom at all, believing in the strong chance that they were focusing time on a false lead. Yul Swinney himself never did confess, always denying that he was, in fact, the dreaded killer. And on top of all this, dozens of officers and sheriffs from Miller County and Texas City worked tirelessly for 6 months to validate Peggy Swinney's story of her and her husband's whereabouts. And finally, they deduced that Peggy was, in fact, lying. To many, the case is closed with Yul Swinney. To many others, this does not fit the narrative enough to be a compelling case, leaving the even more terrifying prospect that the killer was free. If this is the case, we must ask ourselves why they stopped then. Did they stop? Or did they just get better at it? It's difficult to tell, and our decisions on it will always be nothing more than opinions, as we, unfortunately, may never now find the truth. Years passed, the rumors slowed, and the stories of the murders on Lovers' Lanes became nothing more than urban legends told around campfires. But then, many strange things happened, as if an eerie epilogue to the narrative would serve as a cliffhanger to another sequel. Over time, the police would receive letters claiming that they had fingered the wrong man in Yul Swinney, and that the actual murderer was still out there. Many of these letters dropped hints and clues on the true culprit, although whether the police did anything with this information is unknown. It is unknown if this was a tasteless prank or if it was a true confession that we had accepted would never come. But in 1999, an anonymous woman contacted a family member of one of the victims. She apologized for what her father had done. A year later, in the year 2000, another victim's family member received the same call, again apologizing for her father's actions. However, it is worth noting that Yule Sweeney had no daughters. The notion of a couple being murdered down a lover's lane has become such a part of society that almost every corner of the world has its interpretation. This even became an unspoken rule amongst slasher films for many years. The couple that goes off to have sex always ends up murdered early in the story. It is the one that behaves, has a close relationship with their parent, and does not seem to follow the rulebook of an average teen that survives, pushing the narrative that sexually active teens deserve it than more so-called innocent ones. The legend started with a hook in the side of a car, inspired by the concepts of actual events. This expanded with a modern audience to become a boyfriend hanging by his neck above the vehicle, adding a sense of guilt and horror to the eeriness of the story. Although, often still, you will hear the tale told one step further, venturing deeper into the slasher movie style. In this version of the story, a couple of teens are traveling home late at night through the woods when the young man's car suddenly conks out, running on fumes for too long and shutting down in the middle of nowhere with no petrol. In the slight moments of panic and frustration, the young man looks up into the distance, noticing what looks to be a large hospital at the top of the hill, beyond the woods. After a little tiff and some firm words to each other out of fear and frustration, the boyfriend tells her to lock the doors and wait in the car whilst he walks to get help. She asks him to stay, as they always do in these stories, but as the man, he decides to go at it alone, to fix the problem. The young woman sits in the car and patiently waits for his return as he asked her to do, trying to keep her eyes away from the strange noises that rustle through the bushes outside, telling herself that it was nothing but the nocturnal animals that had come out to hunt. Hours pass, and still, there is no sign of her boyfriend as she sits in the car in the middle of the woods, lit only by the bright moonlight above. She's beginning to grow more and more nervous as time continues to tick on. More time passes as the moonlight begins its journey across the sky above, creating sharp shadows of the treetops against the floor outside. The girl begins to doze off, finally edging to sleep until he returns, when she is awoken by the horrifying loud bang on the car's roof. This banging continues as she begins to scream for help. Much like our previous story, this involves a woman trapped in a vehicle with the sounds of something horrifying and unknown on the car's rooftop. But in this version, the events are very different. Her screams are suddenly stifled by the screams of police sirens as several cars arrive surrounding her, flickering a deep blue through the trees. She watches them in a confused state as they all slowly step out of their vehicles, horrified and amazed by something they can see that she cannot. She begins to panic as one pulls out a megaphone and shouts, "Please step out of the car slowly, walk towards us, and do not, at any point, turn around." After a moment of coaxing her out from the police, the young woman opens the car door, flinching as she hears the slight movement of the car's roof thud. She steps out, her entire body trembling, tears pouring down her cold cheeks as she slowly edges towards the police officer who stands in front of her with their hand out. However, the moment she took the officer's hand, as if suddenly feeling an urge of safety, she turns to the car and screams. On top of the vehicle is an escaped murderer from the distant asylum they had mistaken for a hospital. He is jumping around with joy, her boyfriend's severed head gripped in his hand. This tale is one of 3 that I have told in this chapter. However, it is still only a tiny handful of the numerous versions of this legend that spread itself through the zeitgeist. It is always there to remind us that although we are no longer little kids, we are still just as quickly picked off by those who may wish to harm us by the time we learn to drive. This plays on the question, are we ever truly able to claim that we are safe?
Urban Legends is researched, written and produced by Luke Mordew. Original score by Billy Jupp, with additional sounds from storyblocks.com. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, click subscribe on your chosen podcast provider and delve into the mysteries of our previous and future chapters. To find more, including merchandise, video content, images and more, visit urbanlegendsfolklore.com. If you have more information or a correction on something mentioned in this chapter, please get in touch through our website. We aim to ensure that all information provided is accurate and up to date, and this remains a top priority. If you want to support the show, receive early access, and have more of a say in what we do, then become a patron by clicking the link in our show notes. For these chapters in video format, simply search Urban Legends Folklore on YouTube. Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, and Threads, and join our Facebook group by searching Urban Legends Folklore.